8 years. That's the distance between a human voice in Russian crackling through shortwave, Yuri Gagarin is in orbit, and the hush over a television world as boots press into powder gray soil. April 12, 1961 to July 20th, 1969. From a single lap around Earth to a 250,000-mile crossing and back. In between, a promise that sounds like a dare. On May 25, 1961, an American president stands before Congress and turns awe into a deadline. Before this decade is out, land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. It is not a slogan, it is a schedule. And in that moment, the country reframes ambition as a project plan. The problem is cosmic. The solution will be managerial. Rockets will be designed, yes, but so will budgets, factories, checklists, institutions, and the very language of risk. The starting point is fragile. NASA is a young agency. Boosters fail. Guidance is crude. No one has rendezvoused in orbit, docked 2 ships, navigated across cislunar space, or survived a return from 11 kilometers per second. The moon is not just far away. It is beyond the reach of every known procedure. To get there, the United States will have to invent a new way of doing hard things fast, test until breaking, then fix, capture chaos in systems diagrams, put numbers on uncertainty, decide, review, and decide again. Across a continent, a machine begins to assemble. A launch coast of swamps and lightning, a new control center in a Texas prairie. Test stands that shake valleys, clean rooms where white-suited technicians wire aluminum rooms that must become homes. A guidance computer small enough to fly, yet powerful enough to steer destiny. Tracking stations that encircle the Earth so that a whisper from deep space never goes unheard. Thousands of suppliers, hundreds of thousands of workers, and a clock nobody can bargain with. There will be triumphs that feel inevitable only in hindsight, and there will be tragedy that exposes every weakness. But the thesis of this story is simple. America takes a promise and builds a program around it, turning calendar pages into engineering constraints and bending time with discipline. The moon is the destination, the deadline is the engine, and the countdown has already begun. The decision and the deadline, from shock to strategy. Before the moon became a destination with a flight plan, it was a measuring stick for national confidence. The first shock came not from the moon, but from a metal sphere over Kansas, Sputnik, 1957, its beeping a metronome of American anxiety. Project Mercury answered by proving the fundamentals, build a capsule, light a rocket, bring a pilot home. Yet, even as Alan Shepard's 15-minute suborbital arc drew cheers in May 1961, the second shock landed. Yuri Gagarin had already circled the Earth and America was behind. John F. Kennedy did not ask for a miracle. He asked for a schedule. On May 25, 1961, he walked into the well of Congress and converted nervous energy into a single declarative objective. Before this decade is out, land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. The sentence changed more than headlines. It turned a vague desire to catch up into a bounded problem with a fixed delivery date. A pledge became a program, and the clock that had embarrassed the United States would now discipline it. The White House moved first. Kennedy told Vice President Lyndon Johnson, chair of the revived National Aeronautics and Space Council, to survey the landscape and find a space goal the nation could win. Satellites? Lost. Human orbit? Already claimed. A cislunar objective, distant, dangerous, spectacular, could be framed as achievable if the country accepted the price in dollars, risk, and focus. Johnson returned with the argument that would anchor the decade. The Moonshot was bold, yes, but it was also strategically winnable if it was treated like the biggest engineering project in history. NASA, a young agency born from the old NACA, reoriented overnight. The early Mercury organization, capable, nimble, and necessarily ad hoc, could not scale to an undertaking that demanded new rockets, new spacecraft, new math, new software, new manufacturing techniques, and new ways of making decisions. What followed was as consequential as any engine test, a managerial revolution. James E. Webb, the NASA administrator from 1961, and Robert Siemens, his technically fluent deputy, imposed structure with purpose. They created clear chains of responsibility and empowered program offices with the authority and the accountability to turn congressional appropriations into hardware. The Office of Manned Spaceflight formed to concentrate human spaceflight work under a single roof, aligning Mercury, its successor Gemini, and the long-pole Apollo mission into a ladder rather than three separate bets. Schedules and budgets were not afterthoughts. They were design constraints. Geography became strategy. The Army's Rocket Center at Huntsville, Alabama, transformed into the Marshall Space Flight Center under Wernher von Braun, would own the heavy lift that made everything else possible. Langley and the Space Task Group had proven the Mercury capsule. Its work and people would seed a new hub in Houston, the Manned Spacecraft Center, placed near universities and industry, and designed from the ground up as a factory for procedure, simulation, and control. Florida's Cape, soon to be the Kennedy Space Center, would grow into a launch coast, with assembly buildings sized like cathedrals, and pads engineered to cradle titans. Each center had a role. Each role had a chart. The charts had dates. Money alone could not buy a moon landing, but the money signaled seriousness. Congress elevated NASA's budget to genuine national priority levels and held hearings that were less about if than about how fast. Procurement mirrored the urgency. Prime contractors were chosen not just for capability, but for capacity to learn at speed, with the understanding that NASA would stand inside their factories, review their drawings, and veto their wiring if needed. Configuration control boards treated every bolt and line of code as part of a living system. A change in one place rippled through the whole organization chart until it was reconciled. The discipline that wins wars and builds highways entered the hangar. The human piece changed too. Test pilots who had once competed for a seat now trained as an instrumented team. Astronauts who would become procedural experts, checklist authors, and eventually managers. Flight surgeons and human factors engineers joined the conversation early because the vehicle being built was not merely a rocket. It was a life-supporting decision-making system that could not afford ambiguity. Mission rules would be written before they were needed. Simulations would fail on purpose. Go, no-go would be an ethic, not a slogan. Behind the scenes, a new language took root. PERT charts and work breakdown structures replaced hunches. Milestones were defined not as progress but as verifications. Design reviews, qualification tests, acceptance checks, flight readiness confirmations. All-up testing, the radical notion that integrated systems should be tested integrated at full scale, would soon overturn habits that burn time without buying certainty. The goal wasn't to eliminate risk. It was to write risk down, number it, and then either retire it or carry it consciously. Strategy manifested as stepping stones. Mercury would validate heat shields, recovery, and the human machine. Gemini, conceived quickly and with purpose, would teach the arts the moon demanded: long-duration flight, rendezvous and docking, precision maneuvering, spacewalking, and the relentless attention to timeline that cislunar flight would require. Each mission objective was a prerequisite for a future checklist box. Each checklist box corresponded to a hazard that had to be retired before anyone dared light a Saturn V. Institutions evolved to match the ambition. Mission control, first in a cramped room and then in a purpose-built fortress of consoles and screens in Houston, became the most American of inventions, a small city of responsibility, where every seat owned a slice of the system and no decision belonged to a ghost. The manned spaceflight network, antennas spread across continents and islands, extended the reach of Houston's loop so that a spacecraft slipping behind the moon or across the Pacific would still be in a conversation, if not in contact. Universities were welded into the effort. MIT's instrumentation laboratory signed on to build a guidance computer that would turn celestial mechanics into tactile steering cues and digital checks. Industry became an extension of NASA's floor. The national project had addresses, area codes, clock-in times. Nothing about this felt inevitable. The Bay of Pigs in Berlin underscored fragility. The Cold War sharpened the sense that spaceflight was not a pastime, but a demonstration of system competence. Kennedy's speeches, most famously at Rice Stadium in 1962, framed the goal as a test of national character. But inside the program offices, the rhetoric was translated into diagrams and risk registers. Pride fueled momentum, process made it reproducible. There were critics and cautions. Could such speed compromise safety? Would the country tire of the price before the prize? Webb and Siemens carried those questions to Congress and carried Congress back to the factories. Public accountability, through hearings, audits, and press tours, wasn't a burden, it was a forcing function. If you had to explain your chart in public, you made sure the chart closed. If you had to justify a line item, you learned to tie it to a milestone that retired a risk that protected a crew. And there was a moral calculus spoken softly but present in every design review. The risk would ultimately be borne by people with names. That truth shaped decisions large and small. Quick release harnesses, escape systems, redundant valves, materials that wouldn't quietly propagate flame. The moon was a destination. The return clause in Kennedy's sentence was a commandment. By the end of 1962, the outline of a path existed on paper and in poured concrete. A superbooster family called Saturn would grow from modest to monstrous. A 2-seat spacecraft, Gemini, would become a training ground. A 3-part Apollo ship, command, service, and a future lunar lander would divide labor the way good systems do. The agency map was set. The contractor map was being inked. The budgets were still fragile, the politics still volatile, and the enemy was still the calendar. But the shock that had begun with beeps over Kansas had been transmuted into strategy. Define the problem, create the institutions to solve it, and then let schedule, hard, public, unforgiving, be the instrument that kept the orchestra honest. This is how you turn a promise into a program. You draw a line from Congress to the clean room, from a presidential sentence to a checklist in a cockpit. You accept that history will not remember your org charts, but it will be written by them. And you carry forward a thesis that will drive every decision from here to Tranquility Base. The moon is not conquered by inspiration alone. It yields to discipline on a deadline. Choosing the way, architecture, arguments, and the LOR bet. Before a bolt is machined or a checklist is typed, a moon program must answer the most basic question in engineering. What are we actually flying? Not the brand names or the badges, the architecture, the path. Because the moon is not just a place, it is a problem in mass, energy, time, and risk. Choose wrong, and you buy a decade. Choose right, and you buy a schedule. 3 doors stood open in 1961 to 62. Door 1, direct ascent. 1 Colossus leaves Earth. 1 ship goes all the way, down to the lunar surface and back up, then fires home. The elegance is conceptual. No rendezvous, no docking, no split vehicles. But physics is a bookkeeper. If you insist on landing and relaunching the entire Earth return ship, you must lift prodigious mass off the moon, which means carrying more propellant to the moon, which means a far larger booster from Earth. That logic points to a Nova-class rocket beyond the Saturn V, an entirely new industrial mountain to climb, simple in concept, punishing on schedule. Door 2. Earth Orbit Rendezvous, EOR. Launch several manageable pieces on multiple Saturns, assemble them in low Earth orbit like a shipyard in the sky, then go as one unit to the moon, land the whole stack, and come back. This keeps boosters within reach, but multiplies operations. Many launches must succeed in a tight window. Crews must rendezvous, dock, and possibly transfer propellants. Earth orbit becomes a traffic jam with a stopwatch running. Technically feasible, operationally complex, and allergic to the word deadline. Door 3. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR. Fly 2 different spacecraft. Keep the Heavy Heat-Shielded Command and Service Module, CSM, in lunar orbit. Detach a small specialized lunar module, LM, to go down and back. The CSM brings you to the moon and back to Earth. The LM is a round-trip ferry for the last 60 miles. The price: you must master rendezvous and docking not in the comfort of Earth orbit, but 250,000 miles away. The payoff: the mass you must push off both worlds collapses. With less mass, the booster can be real, not mythical. With specialization, each craft does the job it was shaped to do. At first, the center of gravity inside NASA favored the first 2 doors. Wernher von Braun's Marshall team, rightly focused on lifting power, leaned towards Earth orbit assembly or a mighty direct ascent booster. Rendezvous in lunar orbit sounded like an added hazard stapled to the most unforgiving phase of flight. Why gamble there? Into that headwind walked an engineer from Langley named John C. Hubolt. He was not the biggest title in the room, but he asked the biggest question: do we want to go to the moon or not? In late 1961, he sent a letter, circumventing normal channels, to NASA's Robert Siemens, arguing that lunar orbit rendezvous was not a stunt, but a system advantage. By separating the jobs, you divide the mass. By dividing the mass, you bring the goal within the reach of engines and factories the nation could actually build in time. Rendezvous, Hubolt argued, was not extra risk. It was an engineering problem you could train for, simulate, and master once, then reuse on every mission. Numbers joined the argument. LOR's mass ledger was brutal in its clarity. A lander that never sees air can be built like a spaceship, not an airplane. No fairings, no seats, no heat shield, no streamlining. Windows just big enough to aim by. Legs like scaffolding, a body like a room. You lighten the descent, you lighten the ascent, you lighten everything upstream. In a program where pounds are months, the architecture that saves the most pounds saves the most months. That was not romance, it was schedule. Risk is never erased, it is traded. Direct ascent avoids rendezvous but forces an unbuilt booster and a bigger lunar launch. EOR spreads risk across multiple launches and in-orbit assembly in a tight clock. LOR concentrates risk in a single rendezvous around the moon, but it makes that rendezvous repetitive and teachable. Gemini could practice every skill in Earth orbit: station keeping, docking, fuel management, timeline discipline, and the choreography of 2 vehicles becoming one. By the time Apollo flew to the moon, rendezvous would no longer be a leap, it would be a procedure. Institution followed logic. Debates raged across 1961 and into 1962. Face-to-face reviews, memos, mass tables written like pleas. Von Braun's team, initially skeptical, ran the numbers and changed their minds. Engineering courage is not clinging to first instincts, but updating them. In July 1962, NASA made it official. Lunar orbit rendezvous would be the way to the moon. A quiet, radical bet had been placed. That choice immediately reshaped hardware. The big booster did not have to be a never-before-imagined nova. It could be a doable giant, the Saturn V, 3 stages, 5 F1 engines clasped together on the first stage, hydrogen-fueled J2 engines on the second and third. The third stage could restart in space, first to finish Earth orbit, and then to throw the stack toward the moon. One rocket, one launch, one integrated push. A plan that could be scheduled, tested, and repeated. The spacecraft family snapped into focus. North American would shape the command and service module. The pressurized command cabin mated to a service bus with the big engine, tanks, and fuel cells. Grumman would build the lunar module, originally the LEM excursion module, renamed when everyone realized there would be nothing leisurely about it. The LNM would be 2 ships glued together, a descent stage with a throttleable engine and wide footpads to absorb a dust-laden landing, and an ascent stage with its own engine to leap back to orbit. Both stages would drink hypergolic propellants that ignite on contact, easy to store, simple to light, intolerant of plumbing mistakes. No heat shield, no aerodynamic shape, no pretense of Earth, designed for vacuum only. Even the mission profile read like systems poetry. Launch the CSM and LM together under the Saturn V's shroud. After Earth orbit, the third stage burns again, translunar injection, and the stack is hurled outward. The command module turns, docks with the LM, extracts it from the shroud. Now you are a 3-body sculpture against black. Days later, the service module engine breaks the ship into lunar orbit. 2 astronauts crawl through a tunnel into the LM, power it up, undock, and spiral down. The CSM remains in orbit, keeper of the ride home. On the moon, the LM is a house and a crane. When the surface work is done, the ascent stage lights. The crew rises on an invisible ladder, finds the CSM with radar and guidance cues, docks, transfers, and discards the LM. The CSM's engine bends the return arc, trans-Earth injection, and a heat shield earns its pay at the end. Every leg of the journey is done by the craft designed for that leg. Nothing carries a pound it doesn't need. Was LOR riskier? It was focused risk. If ascent from the moon failed, there was no rescue. That truth forced design discipline, simple ignition, redundant logic, ruthless weight margins, guidance cross-checks, consumables budgets that allowed multiple phasing orbits if the first rendezvous did not close. The ethic was not, we hope it works, but we remove unknowns until procedure replaces hope. On the other side of the ledger were risks LOR avoided, developing a supernova booster, refueling cryogenic stages in orbit, or landing a massive Earth return ship on an uncertain surface. Apollo's bet was not that LOR had no sharp edges, it was that its edges could be blunted before the deadline. Choosing LOR also chose America's look on the moon. The LM would not resemble a rocket ship from a pulp cover. It would look like a piece of scaffolding given intention, a bright foiled insect with black windows and spindly legs. Absurd until you realized it was the purest form-follows-function machine ever flown. Inside, astronauts would stand, harnessed. Controls would be spare and close. Windows were small because glass weighs what glass weighs. Every ounce argued for its life. The ship's beauty was the kind that only engineers and people on deadlines recognize. And the choice chose a culture. LOR demanded that rendezvous become a language spoken without accent. It demanded that the guidance computer be trusted as a partner and challenged as an adversary in simulation. It demanded that the mission control loop knit 2 vehicles and 1 planet into a single cockpit. It made Gemini essential, not optional. Those 10 missions in the mid-60s turned rendezvous from verb to noun, from ambition to checklist line. Most of all, LOR aligned with the program's governing truth. Schedule is a design parameter. You do not beat the clock with slogans, you beat it by picking problems you can parallelize, test, and certify in time. One Saturn V instead of 3 clustered launches, one restartable third stage, one family of engines scaled smartly, one lander that is only a lander, one orbit, lunar, in which to do the delicate dance every mission must repeat. When NASA announced its decision in 1962, the public saw a press release. Inside the program, people saw a Gantt chart breathe out. Marshall could concentrate on the Saturn family it believed it could field. North American and Grumman could freeze interfaces and shave weight. MIT could map guidance targets to a rendezvous that would actually happen. The debate did not end. The best debates never do. But it narrowed into refinements rather than forks in the road. Years later, historians would say LOR looked obvious. That is the fate of good engineering. When it works, it feels inevitable. It was not. It was a hard, controversial, managerial act of courage, a willingness to accept a vivid risk in exchange for retiring larger, slower ones. It was the quiet boldness of backing a machine, the LM, that existed only on paper and in argusome meetings, because the math said it would save the only resource you cannot borrow: time. In a program defined by a sentence that came with a calendar stapled to it, choosing the way was the moment America chose the clock it could keep. Lunar Orbit Rendezvous wasn't merely a path to Tranquility Base. It was the architecture that turned a promise into a plan. Building the machine, rockets, computers, spacecraft, control. If a promise is going to leave Earth, it needs hardware the size of policy. Apollo's genius was not a single breakthrough, but the way hundreds of hard problems were forced to agree with one another. Engines with tanks, tanks with structures, structures with guidance, guidance with human hands, until the whole stack behaved like a single mind. Start at the bottom, where power meets gravity. The first stage of the moon rocket would carry the plainest name and the wildest appetite. 5 clustered engines, each swallowing kerosene and liquid oxygen fast enough to drain a swimming pool in seconds and exhaling fire in patterns that could tear themselves apart if the combustion wasn't tamed. Engineers fought instability with science and scars, changing injector plates, adding baffles and acoustic cavities, firing again and again until the flame learned to burn quietly at hurricane force. Above that, a second stage would switch propellants to liquid hydrogen, featherlight, super cold, stored in tanks so large and so thin they had to be built like musical instruments. Hydrogen bought performance, and performance bought mass margin upstream, exactly what a lander and a heat shield would beg for later. A third stage, also hydrogen-fueled, would add one more trick. After placing the stack in Earth orbit, it could light a second time to hurl the spacecraft toward the moon. Restarting an engine in space was not romance. It was plumbing, valves, insulation, and test times scheduled into every calendar on the Cape. The rocket's pieces were born in far-flung factories and then taught on giant test stands to behave. Static fires shook valleys. Whole stages were bolted down, filled, chilled, and ignited so that any weakness would fail where wrenches existed. The scale beggared intuition. Assembly buildings the size of weather systems, cranes that moved like patient spiders, a vehicle assembly building so tall it had its own weather warnings. Beneath the finished rocket, a crawler transporter the size of an apartment building crept on tank treads across Florida marshland to an oceanfront pad engineered to drink sound and heat without flinching. The moon program did not borrow American industry. It stretched it, then made it document how the stretching was done. At the other end of the stack, where humans would live, the spacecraft were not homes so much as arguments settled by checklists. The command module was a heat shield with a cockpit wrapped around it, a pressurized cone where 2 or 3 people could sit, suit valves hissing, eyes moving from windows to dials to a glowing rectangle of numbers. The service module, bolted to its back, was stowage for the machines that made the cone a ship, tanks for oxygen and water, radiators, attitude thrusters, and one big, reliable engine to change orbits and come home from the moon. Everything in this back room was designed around the ethic that had been underlined in the president's sentence: return him safely to Earth. Redundancy where it counted. Isolation where it mattered. A main engine that was simple and steady rather than flamboyantly efficient. The lunar module broke every instinct left over from aviation. It would never see air. It would never endure re-entry. It would never even roll on wheels. It could be all elbows and foil, a 2-story room with legs. The descent stage was a throttleable crane to lower the ship on a column of exhaust, without kicking up enough dust to blind it. The ascent stage was a compact lifeboat with its own engine and tanks, igniting with chemistry that didn't need a spark. Hypergolic propellants that lit when they met, chosen not for beauty, but for certainty. Inside, astronauts would stand in harnesses, their world measured in switches and cue cards, their view through windows just large enough to aim by, because glass weighs what glass weighs. Between those rooms and those engines stood a brain that had to be small, trustworthy, and teachable. The guidance system, inertial platforms, and gyros bolted to the spacecraft's bones, a computer with a face called the DSKY, turned celestial mechanics into tactile steering cues and marching numbers. Memory was woven like cloth, literally, core rope, software threaded by hand so it could survive vibration, silence, and time. The computer wasn't there to be admired. It was there to be argued with in thousands of simulations until crews understood what it meant when an alarm blinked or a verb-noun pair asked a question with no poetry in it at all. Guidance was not magic. It was sensors, algorithms, and conventions shared by pilots, programmers, and flight controllers until everyone dreamed in the same verbs. That last word, controllers, is where the machine's invisible half lives. Apollo built a cockpit on Earth because no cockpit that small can carry every expert. In Houston, rows of consoles faced big screens, but the real architecture was responsibility. Each seat owned a system and a voice. A flight director's cadence, short, declarative, spare, held together thermodynamics and trajectory with English. Call signs, laconic and strange to outsiders, mapped expertise to audible syllables so that in a storm of data, the right human and the right loop could find each other. Only one seat, the astronaut at the Capcom console, spoke to the crew because clarity is a safety system too. Control did not end at Houston's walls. A global network of dishes, remote stations, ships, and islands formed a ring of ears and mouths. When the spacecraft slipped across the Pacific or ducked behind the moon, the loop changed, but the governance did not. Telemetry would be stamped with time and handed to the right console. Commands would be routed and confirmed. Tracking would be fused with radar and optics, and then turned into vector updates that the guidance computer could accept or reject, according to rules written before the countdown began. The point of all that geometry and radio was not romance. It was to make sure, where are we? Never had to be guessed. Everywhere in the system, the same culture pressed down. Design it so it can be tested, test it so it can be trusted. The phrase, all up testing, light every stage together, fly the full stack early, was heresy to some and salvation to schedule. It recognized that integrating late is where programs go to die. If a third stage will only meet its first stage at the pad, then let them meet at the pad in flight, not just in a hangar over paperwork. The risk was visible, but the risk avoided, months of separately perfect subsystems that refused to cooperate at full scale, was greater. Apollo bet that truth would hold, and it did. The same ethic rewired factories. Drawings froze only when interfaces were real. Configuration control boards became courts where every proposed change had to argue its case in terms the whole system could understand. Suppliers learned that a valve is not a valve. It is part of a life support chain whose failure might light a paragraph in a later accident report. When metal met human, human factors were not bolted on, they were written in. Labels, latch directions, the way a gloved hand finds the right toggle in a dark cabin while your heart is hammering. That is engineering too. Checklists turned complexity into choreography. They were not mere lists but compressed doctrine. What to do, when to do it, and what to say out loud so that the loop can hear you doing it. In simulation, controllers failed things on purpose. Computers, valves, sensors, because muscle memory cannot be discovered in a crisis, it must be installed. Go, no go ceased to be a dramatic phrase and became a measured ritual where each seat answered only for what it owned. If your data was green, you said so. If it wasn't, you said so faster. There were trade-offs everywhere, and none were free. Hypergolic propellants simplified ignition and storage, but demanded materials and plumbing that would not react with them in ugly ways. Hydrogen stages soared in performance, but required insulation that stayed put from factory floor to space and back to vacuum. The big first-stage engines were kept intentionally conservative in cycle because stability and reliability are worth 1,000 clever efficiencies when people and deadlines are strapped to the top. The guidance computer could not be a lab curiosity. It had to be mass-produced to identical behavior, its software frozen in a way that allowed confidence but still permitted fixes when a new edge case was found in a simulator at 2 a.m. Even the launch pad was part of the machine. Umbilical towers didn't just hold the rocket, they were arteries that kept it alive until the count reached a number where the vehicle could breathe on its own. Flame trenches and sound suppression turned physics into an ally instead of an enemy. The pad was mobile because flexibility is schedule's friend. If lightning lived on one horizon, a second pad might save a week that later saved a year. And then there's the quiet hero of every big program. The way the paperwork is arranged, work breakdown structures that slice the impossible into solvable. Milestones named for the kind of verification they delivered, not for the size of the ribbon cut at the ceremony. Reviews that were not theater, but true gates, staffed with people empowered to say no and expected to explain that no with specificity. A culture that gradually learned to reward the person who found the problem early more than the person who hit it late. All of these are the bones beneath the headlines. When you add it up, building the machine looks nothing like a single laboratory eureka. It looks like a country learning to make decisions the same way in thousands of places at once. The rocket is obvious in photographs. The spacecraft are famous in museums. The computer's interface glows in movies. But the real invention was the agreement between engine and schedule, code and cockpit, pad and console that allowed those objects to behave as one. The engineering did not erase risk. It wrote it down, fenced it in, and left as little as possible to courage alone. By the time the first moon rocket rolled toward the Atlantic, the shape of the program was visible in steel and people's habits. Engines that lit the same way twice. Computers that spoke a language crews could hear under adrenaline. Spacecraft that did exactly the jobs they were born for and no other. A control room that could turn chaos into past tense. The destination had not changed. But the machine that would get there, physical and human, was now real, heavy, loud, and accountable to a clock everyone could read. Learn fast or fail, skills, tragedies, and redesign. You cannot improvise your way to the moon. You learn the skills in pieces, under pressure, and then you weld them together so tightly that the seams don't show. That is what Mercury and Gemini were for, a crash course in the mechanics of going somewhere new. and a lesson plan written in procedures rather than poetry. Mercury proved the fundamentals at full risk and small scale. Heat shields worked the way the equation said they should. Ablative material charred and carried fire away. Retro rockets fired, parachutes bloomed, and recovery forces found a bobbing capsule in oceans that did not care about headlines. The program also taught humility. On John Glenn's Friendship 7 flight, a sensor suggested a loose heat shield. Ground and crew chose to keep the retro pack on through re-entry as a belt and suspenders hedge. The reading later proved false. The lesson, trust data but make decisions that survive being wrong, stuck. Gemini turned fundamentals into techniques. Rendezvous is not two boats meeting on a lake. It is a dance with gravity where chasing too hard pushes you away. Gemini learned the phasing burns, the plane changes, the braking they don't teach in driver's ed. In December 1965, Gemini 6A and Gemini 7 closed to within feet, proof that two human spacecraft could find each other with precision. In March 1966, Gemini 8 went further. Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott docked to an Agena target vehicle, then the stack tumbled when a Gemini thruster stuck on. Armstrong undocked, killed the spin with the re-entry system, and made an emergency landing. The program earned and paid for the doctrine that docking was to be treated as a procedure, not an adventure. Verify rates, watch for divergent cues, and never hesitate to back away. Spacewalking was another classroom that gave failing grades first. Gemini 4 put Ed White outside on a short, glorious tethered float, photogenic and deceptively easy. Gemini 9. A taught the truth when Gene Cernan tried to work in a vacuum without enough thermal control or handholds. His visor fogged, his heart rate soared, and the task list collapsed. The redesign was not a gadget. It was a philosophy. Build handrails and footholds, plan every grip, and rehearse underwater to make weightlessness a familiar place. Gemini 12 with Buzz Aldrin showed how preparation turned struggle into routine. Properly restrained and choreographed, EVA became a tool rather than a spectacle. Every one of those skills fed Apollo. Precision re-entry meant the command module could hit the narrow corridor home from lunar speed. Rendezvous and docking would be the hinge on which lunar orbit rendezvous turned. EVA would be the difference between standing on the moon and working there. But Apollo would add one more, the hardest to teach: learning from failure without lying to yourself about what broke. On January 27, 1967, the program stopped. A ground test at Cape Kennedy, plugs out, a rehearsal with the spacecraft sealed, filled the Apollo command cabin with a high-pressure, pure oxygen atmosphere. Inside sat Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. A spark, born in wiring and insulation that had not been treated as flammable because paperwork and habit said otherwise, found materials that burned like kindling in oxygen-rich air. The inward opening hatch, complicated and slow, trapped the crew as the fire raced. By the time pad crews fought the door open, the smoke had already written the worst report a program can read. What failed was not a single component. It was a system of assumptions that a ground test atmosphere could be pure oxygen at high pressure because it was simpler. That nylon covers, Velcro, and adhesives were harmless in context. That bundles of wire could snake where they pleased, sharp edges and all, so long as continuity checks passed. That a hatch could be complex because it only needed to open at the end of a mission, not in an emergency at T0. The tragedy stripped those illusions away. The answer was not a speech, though one would become famous. In the control room, Flight Director Gene Kranz told his team they would be tough and competent, a creed instead of a comfort. In the factories and clean rooms, the answer was a redesign that reached from philosophy to fasteners. The command module's interior became a laboratory in flame physics, flammables removed or shielded, wiring rerouted, re-insulated, and guarded against chafe, plumbing rethought, oxygen for ground tests mixed with nitrogen to blunt fire, flight cabin pressure regimes re-examined so that pure oxygen would be used only at low pressure where combustion blazes less freely. The hatch was rebuilt to blow outward and open in seconds, under pressure, by a single motion. Materials science moved from the appendix to the front matter. Beta cloth, a glass fiber fabric coated in Teflon, replaced burnable textiles on suits and in high-risk areas. The crew's checklists and stowage were purged of casual Velcro and reapproved item by item. "That's how we've always done it," became a banned phrase. Management culture hardened in productive ways. Configuration control that had already existed on paper became a lived discipline. No change without impact analysis, no acceptance without traceable tests. Failure modes and effects analysis, FMEA, stopped being a theoretical exercise and started policing the edges where systems touch and unexpected cascade paths hide. Design reviews became gates with teeth. The vendor floor became an extension of NASA. Inspectors and engineers did not just visit, they lived there, signing off on harnesses and welds with the knowledge that their initials were a kind of oath. Training changed, too. Simulations had always been a crucible. After the fire, they became a pressure cooker where communication was as testable as hardware. The simulation supervisor, SimSup, took perverse, necessary pleasure in breaking the world, freezing sensors, failing valves, injecting spurious alarms, forcing controllers and crews to say what they saw, to admit what they didn't, and to surface bad assumptions before the count was real. Go, no-go became a ritual paired to essentials. Each console answered for its slice and nothing else, and the word go was earned, not given. The redesign took time, but it did not break the decade. While the spacecraft was being reborn as Block 2, engineers kept learning in flight. Uncrewed Apollo 4, November 1967, and Apollo 6, April 1968, tested the Saturn V. The first flight roared clean. The second exposed pogo oscillations and engine issues that shook confidence in hardware. The fixes were not slogans. They were accumulators and propellant lines, structural tweaks, and guidance updates that turned a brute force machine into a controlled one. Apollo 5, January 1968, flew the lunar module alone in Earth orbit, ringing out its descent and ascent engines, validating that the little lifeboat could light, throttle, and relight on command without the fairy dust of atmosphere to hide mistakes. By October 1968, a reborn command module took people to space. Apollo 7 spent 11 days in Earth orbit, shaking down the systems that had been rewired by grief and care, and the crew demanded and got proof in data, not promises. The mission's crankiness was famous, its value was priceless. The ship worked. The hatch opened quickly. The wiring stayed quiet. The checklists fit the hands they were made for. 1,000 fixes, invisible to television, added up to a single visible fact. The program had swallowed a tragedy and digested its lessons. Underneath the hardware, a subtler transformation held the whole thing together: quality as culture. The person who found the problem early was celebrated, not sidelined. Contractors learned that audits were not performative. Failed parts brought learning, not punishment, when truth arrived fast. Acceptance tests and qualification tests wore out components on purpose so that flight articles would not be the first to discover weak bones. Proof pressure went up. Red lines, numbers beyond which a test or a flight must stop, were written in ink and obeyed even when schedule howled. Go fever did not vanish, it was fenced, and the astronauts evolved from heroic passengers into co-engineers. They wrote checklists, redesigned switch guards, pushed for better labels and better ergonomics. They sat on review boards and walked factory floors, and their credibility came not from fame, but from fluency. When they threw an attitude hold or called out a computer alarm in the simulators, the loop heard not just a pilot, but a system user who could explain exactly why a word on a panel should be changed. Learn fast or fail was not a motto. It was the only way the deadline could be kept with conscience. Mercury and Gemini bought skills. The Apollo 1 fire forced a reckoning and a rebuild that put safety into the metal instead of into speeches. Simulations turned fear into muscle memory. Reviews turned hierarchy into responsibility. And quality stopped being a department and became the air the program breathed. Only then was the program ready to press outward. The next steps would not be rehearsals but commitments. A brave decision to take a brand new rocket to the moon without a lander on Apollo 8, a full dress rehearsal of the lunar ferry in Earth orbit on Apollo 9, and a near touch of lunar dust on Apollo 10. The clock was still loud, but now when it ticked, it kept time with a different heart, one that had been broken, mended, and made stronger than it had any right to be. The run-up and the landing, 8, 9, 10, 11. The last 8 months before Tranquility Base compressed like a spring. 4 missions, each one carrying a decade's worth of "don't get this wrong," fly in a cadence so tight the calendar itself becomes a test article. December 1968, March 1969, May, July. Each flight moves a single chess piece and then the board changes. Apollo 8, to the moon without a lander. The lunar module is late. The schedule is not. In the summer of 1968, a bold, almost impolite idea surfaces. If the lander won't be ready, then take the command and service module to lunar orbit anyway. Test the Saturn V at full purpose, practice the big engine burns in the place they matter, recon the landing sites with living eyes. It is a commitment disguised as a workaround. On December 21st, a Saturn V leaves Florida with Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders strapped into a reborn command ship. The rocket that had rattled itself with pogo oscillations on an earlier uncrewed flight now climbs steady, 3 stages handing off a single intention. In Earth orbit, the 3rd stage rests, then lights again for translunar injection. The stack falls outward, the first human vehicle to leave the gravity well with intent to return. Across 3 days, the crew nurses trajectory corrections and rehearses the burn that matters. The service propulsion system engine must start, run, and stop with discipline, or the ship will miss the moon or kiss it too hard. On Christmas Eve, the engine does its work. The spacecraft drops into lunar orbit, and history tilts. The gray sphere that had been a telescope's quarry becomes a place with a horizon. Through a small window, Anders frames a blue and white Earth rising over ash-colored hills, an image of home that will outlive the century. The crew reads from Genesis, a human gesture across a void threaded with telemetry, and then returns to the work. Surveying Maria and candidate sites, practicing the cadence that mission control will need to hear when landings are real. After 10 revolutions, the SPS lights again for trans-Earth injection. When Apollo 8 splashes down on December 27th, the program has rewritten its risk ledger. The big engine is trustworthy. The guidance can wrap around another world. Lunar orbit is a place you can go on a schedule and leave when you decide. Apollo 9, the lunar ferry earns its wings in Earth orbit. March 1969. Different test, different skills. If Apollo 8 was about distance and engines, Apollo 9 is about the choreography LOR demands. Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweikart launch with 2 ships under the shroud and 2 call signs. The command service module Gumdrop and the lunar module Spider. In low Earth orbit, they undock, turn, and extract the insect. proving the docking tunnel and the clean interchange of power and air that will matter 250,000 miles away. Then they split the stack. The LM flies free for the first time, a foil-skinned room with a purpose. The descent engine throttles smoothly, the ascent engine lights on command, guidance swaps between redundant brains. Schweikart steps outside in the LM's backpack life support, wearing the system that will let a person work on the moon without an umbilical, proving that the suit is not just clothing, but a spacecraft. Rendezvous and docking are performed not as stunts, but as repeatable procedure, rates verified, needles centered, call-outs crisp. The mission finds rough edges. Schweikart's space sickness complicates one EVA plan. Timelines learn humility, but the essentials stick. The lander's a vehicle, not a sculpture. It can depart, maneuver, return, and mate, and the crews can translate between ships without drama. The LOR bet gains muscle memory. Apollo 10, dress rehearsal in lunar orbit, May 1969. One more step and no cheating. Tom Stafford, John Young, Gene Cernan take Charlie Brown, CSM, and Snoopy, LM, all the way to lunar orbit. Everything that will happen on Apollo 11 happens here, except the last 50,000 feet. Undock, inspect. Fire the descent engine and ride down along the exact corridor that ends at the Sea of Tranquility. Track the guidance against landmarks. Call the craters. Confirm that the lighting angles match the map and that a pilot can actually see what the map promised. Near the bottom of the corridor, Snoopy stages, jettisons the descent section and lights the ascent engine. Then something disquieting happens. A misset guidance switch triggers a wild rolling divergence. Training and checklists do what they were made to do. Stafford and Cernan sort the mode, steady the rates, and tame the ship. The near miss is not failure. It is a gift opened in rehearsal rather than in performance. Snoopy finds Charlie Brown. Docking is crisp. The data is gold. Back on Earth, the lesson is written down where everyone can read it. No switch position is trivial. No redundancy is extra. Apollo's finals week is over. The only thing left is the exam. Apollo 11, T- to Tranquility Base, July 16, 1969. The morning air at the Cape carries heat and salt. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins ride an elevator into a white room above a nation's breath. The Saturn V lights with its familiar, now less terrifying shudder. A slow, confident rise gives way to acceleration that presses suits into couches. Staging is clean. In orbit, they check the ship and then commit outward. The CSM Columbia turns and docks with the LM Eagle. The stack becomes the three-piece sculpture designed in meetings 7 years earlier. Approach is serenity and homework, mid-course corrections, platform alignments, checks that feel like superstition, until you remember how thin the margins are. At lunar orbit insertion, the SPS burns hard and true again. The ship drops into an elliptical path that will be trimmed to a near-circular lane over the Sea of Tranquility. Collins stays with Columbia, keeper of the ride home. Armstrong and Aldrin power up Eagle, undock, and begin the sequence that every simulator in Houston has killed them with. Power descent initiation, PDI, is a bend in the script. The LM rotates engine down, the descent engine lights and throttles. Guidance begins feeding a steady rain of numbers. Almost immediately, surprises stack. Computer program alarms 1202 and 1201, executive overflows, blink into the crew's world. In mission control, the guidance backroom has rehearsed this exact ambiguity. The call through the front room is calm and decisive. Go. The cause, an over-busy rendezvous radar quietly stealing cycles, doesn't matter in the moment. What matters is that the computer is shedding non-critical work and keeping the guidance task upright. The descent continues, then the landing point. The LM's computer is taking them toward a field strewn with craters and boulders. not the smooth plane they bought with reconnaissance. Armstrong asks the computer for manual authority and flies the ship forward, skimming on a thin budget of propellant. The call-outs are textbook and human at once: velocity, altitude, fuel. Dust blossoms, threatening to erase the ground. Aldrin watches the needles and keeps the numbers coming. In Houston, a controller marks the 60 seconds fuel call, then 30 seconds. Armstrong holds attitude, floats forward, and eases thrust. The LM settles. Contact probes kiss the surface. The engine cuts. A voice that is flatter than history deserves comes up from the moon. Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. The Capcom's reply is laughter and restraint. We copy you down. We're breathing again. They do not rush outside. Checklists first. Systems steady. A pause to let dust settle and heart rates fall. Then the slow-motion ritual begins. The hatch opens awkwardly because the lander is small. A ladder that no one has climbed on the moon becomes a last test of handholds and choreography. Armstrong steps onto powder that behaves like talc and memory. His words may be debated forever in the transcripts, but the act is simple and global. A boot sole presses into a place that has lit human stories since language began. Aldrin follows, careful and sure, describing the surface in the engineer's poetry the program has taught him. Magnificent desolation. They do the work. A flag that might not stand in vacuum is coaxed into place. A plaque is uncovered. We came in peace for all mankind. Experiments are deployed with the matter-of-fact grace of good design. A retro reflector that will ping laser light back to observatories for decades. A passive seismic package that will listen for the moon's quakes. A foil to taste the solar wind. Sample bags filled with rocks and dust because geology beats metaphor when you're writing real history. Cameras watch, but checklists drive. Inside Columbia, Collins orbits alone, a human and a machine carrying the only engine that can bring 3 people home. His calls are steady. The ship stays healthy. Contingency plans sit on his panel like polite ghosts who never materialize. When the EVA ends, Eagle becomes a house again. Sleep is an idea more than a reality. Adrenaline and telemetry crowd the cabin. The next act is the most unforgiving of simple actions: ascent. There is no rescue if the engine won't light. It lights. The ascent stage kicks free from the descent legs and climbs on invisible rungs. Radar and guidance fold the 2 ships into one again. Docking is by the book. Samples and film move through the tunnel, and Eagle is cut loose to die quietly in lunar orbit as planned. Home is a single burn away. Trans-Earth injection arcs Columbia back toward the blue world that rose over gray ridges on Apollo 8's 4th orbit. Re-entry at lunar return speed is a corridor, not a suggestion. The heat shield earns its existence, and the ocean takes the ship back with the familiar, anticlimactic violence of splashdown. July 24th, 1969. Recovery forces swarm. Quarantine protocols, designed in a world that refuses to bet against unknown biology, fold the crew into a polished aluminum trailer, the mobile quarantine facility, on the deck of USS Hornet. A president waves through glass. The country exhales. What worked, what almost didn't. The Saturn V worked, loud, disciplined, repeatable. The decision to fly Apollo 8 to lunar orbit without a lander bought calendar months the deadline did not have to spare. Gemini's rendezvous grammar paid off in the tightest moments of Apollo 10 and Apollo 11. The Apollo guidance computer kept its head when interrupts stacked, and the culture in Houston trusted a pre-rehearsed GO instead of inventing one in panic. The LM's throttle saved the landing site. Armstrong's piloting saved the landing. Fuel margins went thin by intent, but not by accident. The checklists, those humble, ruthless distillations of procedure, turned near surprises into managed deviations, and the redesign after the fire was everywhere, in hatch geometry, in wiring that did not lie, in materials that refused to carry flame. Those are not footnotes. They are the bones of success. In 8 months, the program executed a staircase. 8 proved the path, 9 taught the dance, 10 rehearsed the scene, 11 performed. The clock that had defined the story did not stop at touchdown. It stopped when 3 people and a box of rocks were safely aboard a ship rolling on the Pacific. Only then did the sentence spoken in 1961 read true in the past tense. Only then did a deadline become a legacy. Finale, what the moon changed. The moon did not move. We did. In 8 years, a country taught itself to turn a sentence into a schedule into hardware, and hardware into history, and the wake of that motion reaches everywhere we live. The first change is invisible but permanent: how to do the impossible on time. Apollo refined a grammar for big endeavors, work breakdown structures that slice giants into pieces you can lift, configuration control that keeps thousands of changes from colliding, design reviews with teeth, all-up testing that flies the full stack early, simulations that fail on purpose until success is muscle memory. The words FMEA-PERTGO/NOGO became common property. They left the pad and walked into factories, hospitals, air traffic control, chip fabs, and anywhere a deadline and human life share the same room. The second change is silicon. Before Apollo, integrated circuits were promising curiosities. After Apollo, they were a procurement line with requirements and yields. The Apollo guidance computer didn't invent the microchip, but by buying thousands and forcing reliability, the program helped push costs down and quality up. Software, too, grew up under pressure, typed into rope memory and checked by people who knew that ambiguity was a hazard. It taught a new discipline: version control, interface freezes, alarms that fail gracefully, code reviewed by the same rigor that inspects a weld. Those habits seeded the culture that would run airliners, power grids, and eventually the computers in our pockets. A third change is cultural and moral. Earthrise, that blue marble rising over gray, punctured the illusion that our maps are the world. You could not look at that photograph and still believe borders have meaning in vacuum. Out of that view came a language of stewardship, an environmental movement that learned to speak in data and images, international treaties that treat space as a commons, and the quiet understanding that perspective is not sentiment, it is policy. The moon gave us a mirror. We looked, and some of us began to behave as if we'd seen ourselves. The fourth change is institutional courage. Apollo proved that a democracy can pick a finish line in public and then run toward it with accountable speed. The price was high: billions of dollars, risk measured in human names, a tragedy that killed 3 men and forced everyone to rebuild their conscience alongside their spacecraft. But the lesson that endured is not anything is possible. It is hard things are possible when responsibility is specific. A flight director owns the call, an engineer signs the drawing, an astronaut reads the checklist out loud so a room full of experts can disagree in time to save him. That ethic remains the thin line between ambition and folly. Apollo also left hardware behind: seismometers that listen to the moon quiver, retroreflectors that still wink laser light back to observatories, samples that keep changing what geology thinks it knows. But the most durable artifact is competence, the way a country learned to think across disciplines and distances, a crawler way across a swamp, a console in Houston, a dish on a Pacific island, a factory in Ohio that learned to build the same valve the same way every Tuesday. Those are not footnotes. They are the arteries of a nation that, for a while, beat to the same clock, Not everything was triumph. Budgets fell after the flag, other needs reclaimed the headlines, and the ladder built for the moon became a museum piece sooner than its builders hoped. Yet even the fade-out taught something essential. Glory is a poor business model. Process is the legacy. The people who carried checklists out of Apollo carried a method that would surface in quiet places, safer cockpits, sturdier bridges, cleaner code, manufacturing that wastes less and delivers more. And somewhere inside all of this, a softer change. A 10-year-old watching a grainy broadcast learned that history is not only something you inherit, sometimes it is something you ship. That child grew up to write a line of code, weld a seam, chair a review, vote for a bond, or raise a hand when a room needed someone to say, "Stop." We don't know that yet. The moon landing did not make us better. It made us answerable to what better requires. So the story ends where it began, with a clock. In 1961, a president set one. In 1969, a crew stopped it by coming home. What remains is the template they left us for every unforgiving countdown to come. Define the problem, choose the architecture, build the machine, learn fast, tell the truth, fly the plan. The moon is still there, quiet and indifferent. We are the ones who changed, into a people who know now what it takes to go from promise to footprint and back again.